Welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is great to be with you on this Friday, May 9th. I'm going to stop saying good morning to people because I have no idea what part of the world that you're tuning in from. Momodou is joining us today from London. So take a minute, of course, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and share it in your social media. Let folks know that this conversation is going on live right now, that they can join in. If they're not able to watch it live, make sure to share it with folks after the fact. I'm sure this is going to be just an excellent conversation. Just want to say a couple of things up front. I just, first of all, I just want to express, I was trying to think of the right words. I think that Momodou Taal has acted in a manner, has behaved in a manner, since October 7th that is, something that we should all kind of aspire to in terms of our commitment. I'm just excited to be able to talk to him about, his work, some of his own politicization, and, maybe have a fuller conversation than we might be able to have on, some other platforms that have obviously also covered the importance of, his case and the kind of repression that he's faced, and, the issues of American universities and the policing of speech and so on, which are all like really important aspects. But I don't want it to get lost also that, Mamadou, was doing a lot of great work before October 7th as well. And, is just somebody that I think, folks should be engaging with, listening to the Malcolm effect, and, also seeing the ways that, he has stayed. I think one of the things that I would say most importantly is that when you're being attacked or when you're facing repression, it's very easy to have this impulse to kind of make everything about yourself. And I feel like one of the things that I appreciate about how Mamadou Tall has navigated all of this is the way that he has always kept the centrality of Palestine and of Gaza throughout this. And we're in a time where we have basically a 2 month starvation campaign going on the back of 18 months of genocidal warfare, on the back of 77 years of kind of genocidal actions towards the Palestinian people in their land. And I think it's just really important that as we have these discussions that we're able to make these connections and not get lost in the repression, even though we also have to be able to talk about the repression politically and organize around it. And, so anyways, I just wanted to say that before I brought Mamadou to the stage. So Mamadou Tall is a PhD student at the University of Cornell. He sent me that, so I assume that's still the case. We'll talk about that. His work focuses on conceptualizations of sovereignty with a particular focus on West Africa. Mamadou Tall is the host of the Malcolm Effect podcast, which you can find wherever you get, your audio podcast, same places you get our audio podcast. It's a show dedicated to political education in an accessible manner. All right, Mamadou, welcome to the show. It's good to be with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for such a gracious introduction. Just to also big up Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, one of my favorite shows. I'm not just saying that. I mean, whenever people message me and be like, I need to learn about this or this topic, I'm like, okay, cool. Go to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. So I kind of feel that for such a long time, actually, not just recently, but I feel like my work is very much in conjunction with the work that you do as well. And we have similar topics and themes. And whilst you may, I think, have perhaps more longer form and maybe even in more in depth, I think that it works together as like in the left sphere of political education. So thank you so much for the work that you do as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I think about your podcast as well in terms of, I think there's a very similar kind of inspiration for it, or, you know, a kind of reason for its existence, which,
Yeah.
I mean, like Josh and I, so we started ours in 2017,
Mhm.
but for us, it was kind of like we felt like at that time that a lot of conversations about the left were kind of social democratic oriented,
Mhm.
the 99% versus the 1%, and we need a better distribution and these kind of
Yeah.
things. And there was also a lot of discussion in the United States at that time about what people called the Bernie bro phenomenon, white leftists that were supporting Bernie. And we're like, this is just not the actual interesting history of socialist or
Mhm.
communist kind of thought or anti-imperialist thought. It wasn't anti-imperialist, first of all, in the United States even. And so we were like, well, let's start to re-excavate, the
Yeah.
radical aspects of Black Power, of the Communist Party USA, and on and on. And I think the piece that I've kind of heard you articulate that I think is similar is we also didn't approach it like we knew, especially in the beginning. I mean, we've learned a lot through the last, I'm sure you have too. You learn a lot doing this, but it was like, if we're going to engage in this learning process and we want to lift up and learn from these movements, it would be selfish of us to do this just for ourselves. So we
Yeah.
want to be able to kind of share our learning process with people as we're going along. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I've always said that, my podcast was essentially me doing my learning in public. Right. And I wasn't like shameful about that, or like there's no shame in not knowing something. I know sometimes people get a bit awkward or feel like, oh, I need to know this, because the way Twitter is, you can be arguing with people and people are dunking on you. But like, no, I mean, I very much openly say my radicalization came during the BLM moment. Whilst I say I've always had like political family or whatever it may be, I've always had like an interest in politics, but I would say serious study came during the process of during the BLM moment of Black Spring, etc. And then I was just so like bewildered by everything and so excited by everything, like a kid in the candy store. I was like, I want to learn this and what's there. What do you mean by dialectical materialism? And I remember like every time I'd ask someone, they'll give me a different response, right? And I was like, okay, how am I going to understand this? Okay, what's imperialism? And then later on, I kind of developed in my own intellectual journey. But fundamentally, my podcast it's not, it's not a debate show, right? It's not like me being antagonistic to my guests. It's very much like, I've read a piece that I found interesting, and I want to just explore that with you. And these are genuinely the questions that I have, in the hope that by doing it publicly, it probably hopefully speaks to what other people have in mind as well. So yeah, so I really appreciate. Yeah, so I really feel like my work is very much like a part of the work that you're doing as well. So again, once again, thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. I feel a lot of kinship, and yeah, it's kind of an ecosystem, right? And we're part
Yeah.
of the same, kind of ecosystem that way. Um, and I say a little bit about Malcolm for you, because I always like, I mean, so my politicization is similar. Like, I didn't really get into deep study until the BLM moment. For me, it
Yeah.
was like 2014, 2015 that I started to really like read and study. But I was, as you similarly, I had parents that were left and
Yeah.
political, and um, but but for me also reading the autobiography of Malcolm X in high school, like I've described it sometimes as an epistemic break, which,
Mm.
just to break down for people, not into that kind of language. I mean, basically, I had a worldview, or I thought I kind of understood the way things were before reading that book. And that book shattered what that understanding was. It, it basically was a moment where I was like, okay, yeah, a lot of what I have been told is a lie. There is a kind of propagandized, and also, you know, the fundamental, my father always was like very much a kind of, nonviolence is
Mhm.
the answer.
Yeah.
And I read that and I was like, why are we always taught that as well? But I'm just curious for you, because you obviously use Malcolm, quotations in your intro, and name the podcast The Malcolm Effect, like what that influence was for you.
Absolutely, yeah. No, and I can relate to that. I remember, so I received the autobiography of Malcolm X for my 15th birthday. And this is also a time where I'm also like rediscovering my faith as well in many ways. This is also at the time of Obama's election. So I'm kind of like learning about like, oh, different aspects of Black politics in the US particularly. And as you said, it's like, I don't know who said this, but I remember reading this and I thought to myself, I can relate to this. So like I resonate with this so heavy. And then someone said, I read Malcolm and he redeemed me. And that was that moment for me, right? Maybe you can think, I'm trying to think of who exactly said that.
I've definitely heard this quote, and so now
Yeah.
I'm trying. Well, oh, it's George Jackson, right? I mean, he does the
Yeah. I mean, George
yeah,
Jackson
and
speaks about it with Mao. I remember with Mao and others as well, and Marx and Lenin as well. But
yeah,
I remember
yeah.
someone also saying this to do with Malcolm as well. And I just thought to myself, that has exactly been my experience. Because I remember receiving it at the 50. And again, you said growing up as like a young Black man in the UK, trying to navigate your race, your relationship to race, you're coming into consciousness about race, right? Because now race becomes a staple feature of your daily life now, right? Whereas before, maybe you weren't as attuned to it. You start to see race becoming, oh, people respond to you differently. I'm growing up as a teenage Black man. Police stop me more. Police are very aggressive when they stop me. And I'm just understanding. And I think trying to make sense of that as a young man is very difficult, right? And what Malcolm does for me is that he just, as you said, epistemic break, he gives you language, right? Malcolm provides you with language to understand your positionality in the world as a young Black person, Black man, particularly at that time, but also Black people in general. And then you learn about his character. Then first and foremost, his intellect was always inspiring to me. Like, you know, the stories of memorizing the dictionary, and I'm like, who is Malcolm reading? Because I'm like, I'm going through his speeches, and his analysis is like always on point. It's always on point, and not just things to do with United States politics, but he's speaking about China and Mao. He's speaking about the difference between China and India. He's speaking about you know, until Mississippi is fixed, we could talk about the Congo, for example. He's making all these international connections, and you know, he hosts Fidel shortly in Hotel Teresa in New York, right? And there's all these international connections. I'm thinking, who is he reading? Where is Malcolm getting this from, right? And then you like to learn, you know, his own history with his parents being Garveyites, etc., etc., and also his own intellectual journey. And then I think you read the autobiography, which is amazing, but then you realize afterwards there's so much more the autobiography. And again, I think the film and the autobiography are great introductory, but they miss out a lot. And then you start reading other autobiographies or other Malcolm's letters, for example, or people that knew Malcolm in interviews. And I feel like I was just swimming in that. And I think fundamentally, to go back to what I said, he provides you with a grammar to make sense of the world in which you're in. And it's still so relevant today, right? You can pick up some of Malcolm's speeches, particularly around Democrats and Republicans, and particularly around voting and Black bourgeois, and you think he's speaking today, right? You think he's speaking today. And I think that's like the intellectual side, but then just his character. I always say that, you know, may Allah make me just a fraction of what Malcolm was. And I remember I finally was able to come to the United States in about 2019, and I made it a point to go to Malcolm's grave, right? And then the first thing that struck me was the dates, right? It was 1925 to 65, and this was 2019. And I said to myself, wow, this is an individual who has been under the ground than he was ever on it. Yeah, more time under the ground than he was ever on it. But he's still having an impact. I remember, just like a side point, there was a time on Twitter, like the trend, you know, these trends on Twitter. It was like, show us your wallpaper. And I kid you not, I think every single young Black man had a picture of Malcolm on their phone screensaver, right? And I'm just thinking to myself, what, as someone of faith as well, I'm like, what relationship for me did he have with the Almighty that even with such a long time past, just your image inspires sincerity. Just your image inspires revolutionary, like the adoption of a revolutionary practice, right? And a commitment to struggle. So yeah, I mean, I think we could speak like for hours about Malcolm, but that for me
Yeah.
is the Malcolm effect. Everything I've talked about, my activism, my relationship to how I understand faith, that is personally the Malcolm effect. That is, and I always say that for me, if I can do one thing, it would be my contribution would be to honor one of the greatest men I think has ever lived in human history. I want to honor that legacy and be attached to that legacy for time to come. I can say my contribution was I upheld Malcolm as a figure who I think is a role model and continues to be a role model and should be a role model for so many people.
That's great. Yeah. It makes me, I'll say two more things and we'll move on because I agree we could just have a whole episode where we talk about Malcolm. But
And his
the,
birthday 10 days, so it's his
yeah, yeah. By the way, I do want to shout that out. I'm going to be doing a collaboration with Freedom Archives on May 19th. And so stay tuned for that. We're going to have a collaborative episode. Um, but as far as, and also shout out to Dr. Jared Ball, who I saw in the chat. He's been doing great series on, Malcolm, 100 Years of Malcolm, every week on Black Liberation Media. I'm sure people are checking that out, but do if you are not.
Shout out Jared
So
Ball. Jared Ball,
yeah. The two things I did want to say was one, Mariam Kashani, we had a couple episodes with her recently, and she says in her book, Medina by the Bay, that, and I can't remember the term because it's Arabic and my memory with terms in other languages is not good, but it's something along the lines of, Malcolm not quite being a prophet, but being someone who revitalizes and brings Islam into like kind of a new phase of revitalization, basically. And she talks about that in respect to him.
Might be the phrase mujaddid. I don't know if it's similar, but we have a concept within Islam, in Sunni Islam anyway, that every 100 years there's a revival, there's a reviver, right?
Yeah.
And this person revives the faith, right? And I've always said that Malcolm embodies what we say as a reviver, mujaddid, or also what we say, the wali, a friend of Allah as well, that these people are in proximity. Because for me, a part of being a Muslim, we are commanded to follow the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, right? And you find that the prophets, bar none, the ones that I mentioned in the Quran, were all counterculture, right? They all went against the dominant structures of the day. And I feel like Malcolm is a perfect embodiment of that as well.
Right on. Yeah. The other thing was that Michael Sawyer, I believe, who wrote a book, Black Minded, The Political Philosophy of Malcolm X. He said, so for him, he was talking to Jamil Al-Amin, formerly H. Rap Brown. He was writing letters to him and he wanted to understand the influence of Fanon actually on SNCC and on the Black Liberation and Black Power movement and the Panthers and so on. And Jamil Al-Amin said, no, actually it was Malcolm. Like we read Fanon, but Malcolm was the political philosopher that most, influenced all of us. And of course that makes a lot of sense, but it's interesting, because, and I think there's a really interesting relationship between Fanon and Malcolm too, that, good topic for exploration. But all right, let's see. So yeah, I mean, the first question I had, we've kind of covered some of it, but I guess what I would say is that, obviously there's been a good amount of coverage around the repression that you face from Cornell and the US State Department. And I know we'll talk about that some more. It's important to keep talking about that related to the pro-Palestine solidarity work there that you were a part of. But, there hasn't been as much of an emphasis on what you do with the Malcolm Effect, which we've kind of talked about. But the other aspects of it are, your scholarly work in the Academy and, any other organizing or projects that you're a part of. I know we'll also talk a little bit about Vox Ummah, but you can talk about that now too, if you want to. But I just thought we'd start there with, people getting a little bit of fuller understanding of who you are and the politics that animate your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, you always go through a journey of politicization and constantly trying to read and constantly trying to, I guess, acquire more knowledge. But I'll say, in short, I'm Pan-Africanist. I root myself in the tradition of Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Toure, Kwame Ture, Sankara, and hopefully now Ibrahim Traore. We're following that quite closely. But fundamentally, I'm Pan-Africanist, meaning that, and I define it as the way Sekou Toure, Kwame Ture, and others define it, that the total unification and liberation of Africa, the African continent, under scientific socialism, in that I understand my Pan-Africanism in the way that Nkrumah understood it. And I think people need to be honest when they speak about Nkrumah. Yes, Nkrumah has definitely, you know, most thinkers are thinkers in time. You know, and if you're going to be honest to a thinker, you have to take the thinker throughout their life and, you know, take them at their word oftentimes, and their actions, of course. But you can't just have like, oh, I'm taking Nkrumah and this snapshot, because the Nkrumah in Guinea post the coup is very explicit, right? He's one of his first books is Class Struggle in Africa, right? A recognition that maybe he wasn't as attentive to the class question as he should have, right? Handbook on revolutionary warfare, right? Neocolonialism, which is attributed for the reason why he was effectively and essentially couped. And also as well, like Nkrumah in his interviews in his Conakry years, when he's a guest of Sekou Toure and also made somewhat like a vice president, he is explicit that his understanding of Pan-Africanism is to advance the global socialist and communist revolution. Right, he's very explicit about that. Now you can go to his talks about how he understood Marxism, Leninism, for example, etc. But he's explicit that that is his Pan-Africanism, and that is my Pan-Africanism, and that also speaks to why my Pan-Africanism is deeply rooted in anti-imperialist praxis. Right, I've had some people online talk about, not many, but sometimes, oh, you're Pan-Africanist, why do you care so much about Palestine? I mean, it's a ridiculous question, but for the simple fact, first and foremost, I'm a human being. That's the first question. That's the first kind of response. But beyond that, analytically, if the world is allowed to continue in this way with such, if Zionism can continue and the US imperialism is able to continue with such impunity in the way it has been thus far, then I don't even see a prospect of a Pan-Africanist future. Because any person that rises up to challenge US imperialism will be crushed if we do not say that what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza and what the US imperialism is doing more broadly, it has to stop. And when I say identify that as a primary contradiction, I recognize that whilst we have reactionary governments, etc., across the continent, the primary source of oppression facing Black people around the world are the material conditions of existence, right? And addressing that is addressing issues of capital, of imperialism as well. My own scholarship, again, you said in the beginning, deals with conceptualizations of sovereignty. I'm particularly interested in the question of countries that are, you know, dealing with the legacies of balkanization, that are dealing with the legacies of colonial economies, right? Many of our economies were carved out in ways to produce a single export, for example, right? How do you diversify economies? So I'm interested in political economy. I take Guinea under Sekou Toure as my site of analysis, but more broadly, I'm interested in looking at questions of how imperialism, for me, dialectic is very simple. Imperialism and anti-imperialism. It's a question of sovereignty and the reclamation of the denial of sovereignty and the reclamation of sovereignty as well. So I kind of look at, these are kind of questions I'm thinking through and looking at, particularly focused on West Africa, but more broadly, I guess, the histories of anti-imperialism. And that's like where my PhD is right now. As you said, I am finishing my degree remotely. Thank you. I have a few years to finish. And those who know, who are doing PhDs, know that you say one thing today and within a year's time, you're already thinking and rejigging your questions. But these are the kind of questions I'm thinking about theoretically, that in countries that are dealing with the legacies of balkanizations and colonial economies, what does the reclamation of sovereignty look like in these places, right? And I take Guinea and Ghana as my sites of analysis.
Right on. Thank you. That's fascinating, and I look forward to seeing like the work as it develops. It's definitely a history that I'm really interested in. Amilcar Cabral is one of my kind of favorite folks, and obviously he spent a lot of time around both Nkrumah and Sekou Toure as he was, you know, leading his revolution in Guinea-Bissau. Um, All right. So let's talk. So we'll talk a little bit. We'll get into your story, not your
Mhm.
story, but the recent kind of stuff a little bit. So you come to Cornell to study.
Yeah,
I've heard you said this was one of the comments I heard you say somewhere was that a reference that speech is limited in the UK, and I understand what you're talking about in terms of like the laws that they have around what people can say about, for instance, different Palestinian resistance groups, for example. And I feel like that's kind of a direction that the US is working its way towards currently, you know,
absolutely.
and you and others are kind of a prime example of watching that process unfold. But say a little bit about why you came to Cornell and how that experience, you know, shifted after October 7th.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few reasons. Fundamentally, it was I wanted to work with particular professors. So I'm working with a professor called Professor Siba Grovergy, Professor Russell Rickford, Professor Makoma Wangugi, Professor Judith Byfield. These are amazing scholars, right, in the Black radical tradition who have a particular focus on Pan-Africanism. So I want to work with these folks as well. I also know the legacies of Africana at Cornell. It has like an activist, had an activist legacy, and we can talk a bit about that, where that is today. That was one of the other reasons why. And also as well, like, you know, we do here in the UK, my perception of America was like, besides the Bible, the Constitution is the most sacrosanct, sacred document in the world, right? And we always hear about First Amendment and how important the First Amendment is, and it almost becomes, you know, the golden calf upon which is worshipped by so many. And the UK is a bit more stringent when it comes to, you know, we don't have an absolute free speech rule, right? Not to, and that's not to say, by the way, like I'm a free speech absolutist, because I'm not, right? I do think a lot of the time free speech is, as understood in a lot of these Western societies, it is like a very bourgeois conceptualization of free speech, right? The ability to just insult and say and do whatever you know, and just harm people, for example. And we can talk a bit about that. But more importantly, again, my perception from the UK is that there is this document, the Constitution, the First Amendment, that is sacred and is upheld. But what we've seen, and again, this is quite unsurprising actually, that in the service of empire, in the service of genocide, these notions of all liberal notions are evacuated extremely quickly. Right, these notions of like free speech, democracy, etc., which we already know in the class society represent the dominant classes or bourgeois conceptualizations of these things. We know that in times of crisis, particularly, these things become evacuated, and we can talk about what happened in post October the 7th. And I'm still reeling from that, right? I said some things on October the 7th, which I absolutely stand by. But every journalist in America is like, well, you tweeted this on October the 7th. I'm like, well, okay. Well, it's either you have free speech or you don't. You have it in, you know what I mean? It's either you do or you don't. These are the things that you can't have an in-between position, right? Especially very hypocritical, because I think for so long, ad nauseum, we've had to hear the right talk about the left being snowflakes, the left not cancel culture, the left not embracing or accepting free speech. But what that just meant is that you want to have your free speech to just be racist or be transphobic or be homophobic, or, you know, just to harm people, not to advance ideas, but just to be, I don't think I can swear, right? Just to be a Oh, I
You
can.
can.
Okay. Just to be a dickhead, right? So that's in the service of that. But then now we're talking about like to be anti-genocide and to talk about people's annihilation or you know, decades long of genocide. This is when the free speech rules are, you know, are now evacuated, right? And I think Alana Lentin, our good comrade who we both know, makes a very good point to say now we see things of anti-Semitism, and I think she's brilliant in that she's saying that let's not talk about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. It's not being weaponized in that way. It has a particular function. Go behind statements of weaponization, because what it does is that it is propping up and reproducing empire in a particular way. The invocation of Jewish safety, anti-Semitism has a particular function in the production and reproduction of racial capitalism, as Alan Lentin will say. So I think these are like, so again, just kind of a roundabout way of saying I was under the impression that I would get a great education, which I did. I can't lie. And again, these places of we know the right talks about these Ivy Leagues being bastions of Marxism. And I'm like, I wish. Please show me where are these bastions of Marxism and these bastions of radicality. However, I will say what you do get in a lot of these places, these Ivy Leagues in particular, is that you get pockets of radicality. So you get few professors who are brilliant, and I can say we can talk a bit about this. But I had a great support system. It's too many for me to thank right now. But there were professors that were like, you know, bringing me food, for example, ensuring that I'm okay, raising money for legal funds, etc. So I want to say that those people and individuals were amazing. It's all too often the same individuals who turn up, but they were absolutely amazing people who I wouldn't have been able to, I would say, like, not to be dramatic, but like made it through this process without them, right? Without the support they had. But at an admin level, these places are deeply reactionary and conservative, and they will always serve capital first and foremost, and Zionism in this moment as well. But yeah, my education, I would say, I've developed as a thinker. I've been able to like really hone down what I would like to, the kind of work I want to do in the future. I think I've been exposed to so many new ways of thinking and ideas, which I'm very appreciative of. But as an institution, I think it's very clear that, especially these Ivy Leagues, these are the reproduction of the ruling class. These are the reproduction of the intellectual arm of the ruling class. And that's very clear. And I would say that these places condition students in particular ways that the concept of sacrifice or the concept of going beyond yourself is not a cherished value. It's very much, you got to get it how you live it. Individualism, just have to just get your money and get out. But the values where I think that, of critiquing society and moving society forward, that's a minority in these places.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and also want to go wherever this bastion of Marxism. I would actually go back to school.
When you find it, please take me.
To go to the bastion of Marxism. Do you want to say a little bit more about kind of some of the organizing you were a part of at Cornell, and some of the different things that were going on there, and maybe even like some of the different tendencies or tensions you found within organizing there too? Because I think that, I mean, first of all, I just want to shout out like all of the student organizing. I mean, students are turning up again right now, as they should be, at a moment where, everybody needs to be kind of doing what they can. But at the same time, I think it's always interesting to hear perspectives of people who are involved about what are some of the different tendencies and tensions within these spaces too, because they're not all, it's not like everybody's all on the same page, or there's not challenges or contradictions or things like that too. So I'm curious on any reflections you have on all of that.
You have so many, and I'm going to try and write something, because it really was an experience for me, especially the encampment moment. But I would say, in short, after October the 7th, we have a sustained campaign on campus to do with like divestment. And again, we weren't asking for anything extraordinary. We were asking for Cornell to uphold its own divestment policy. Cornell has divestment policy that talks about genocide, the killing of kids, apartheid, and we will consider divestment from these things. But we'll just say, okay, these are your own divestment guidelines that have been approved, voted on, sanctioned by the trustees. So why are you not upholding your own divestment policies when it comes to Israel? So, we had a series of escalations, some building occupations, there were a few arrests, etc. Peacefully, the majority of them, all of them were peaceful, to be honest. And the thing is, what frustrates me, I reject even the kind of the discourse that frames this as peaceful protest versus non-peaceful protest, because what we've seen, it doesn't matter. You can be doing the most innocuous thing and you're going to be abducted. Look at Ramesa, right? She wrote an op-ed, right? Mohsin Mahdawi, all these people who were abducted and taken by ICE. I know the Democratic Party likes to paint, we need to find the perfect victim, right? But again, that doesn't matter. These people, as long as you are taking a stance against genocide, you become an enemy. But to talk about campus protests more specifically, we had tried to go through faculty senate, tried to go through student senate, tried to go through various forms of like the, I guess, regulatory bodies that kind of enact change through campus organizing, which again they are designed to obfuscate and diver and delay and not engage in good faith. We had meetings with the president, we had meetings with high level administration, and then we had the crescendo moment of April 2024 with the encampment. And then the encampment was, I got suspended after day one. And what was fascinating about that is that they were very explicit and said that if you bring the encampment down, we will reverse your suspension. The kind of blackmail they get involved with and hang it over your head. Again, I don't have that power. No individual organizer has that power. That's not how our structures work. And I would never, that's a dereliction of principle anyway. I would never, preserve myself when I'm thinking about the movement. So that was over the summer. Then we came back September 2024. We had a protest in which there was a careers fair that was brought to a standstill. At the careers fair, there was two of our divestment targets. It was L3 Harris and Boeing. I was there for about 5 minutes. I got recognized on the way out. Then, my whole I'll say the troubles restarted because I was threatened with suspension. I mean, I was suspended. I was threatened with deportation by Cornell. There was a huge backlash. Cornell relented, and then they kind of subjected me to apartheid, like bordering across campus. I couldn't go to certain places. But talk about the tendencies. I think the encampment for me offers such an interesting site of analysis, because you have the encampment, the Marx-Leninists, the anarchists, the Maoists. You have the liberals. You have all different tendencies on the encampment, right? And you have people who want to escalate, people who want to de-escalate, people who want to do more. And I think what was really apparent, and I think only because of hindsight, I think it's a very high, intense, stressful situation, and so many of us are just doing things for the first time, and we're working things out in real time, right? And that is praxis in many ways. But I think with the beauty of hindsight, it was very clear that I think we should have had a more robust political education program, either within the encampment or before going into the encampment, which I know would have been difficult because it wasn't like Columbia went up and then everyone just kind of erupted, right? But I think there was particular things that were being said in discussions that I think, for example, the concept of direct democracy, I think it can work in many places, but there can't be a fetishization of that. In a high intensity moment, leadership is not intrinsically bad. Like, you have to have a dialectical approach to it. Leadership is not hierarchy, leadership. These things, in terms of high intensity moments, are not intrinsically evil. And I think people who maybe have have been fed a steady diet of Foucault for quite some time, are unable to kind of see beyond that. And I would say, from my personal experience, that held us up for quite some time. But again, that's just a critique, I think, and I think it's important to have self-critique. I'm sure I have mine as well. People can levy at me as well, but that's just from my perspective when I was there. And I think what the encampment showed was, okay, it was a potential of, if we are talking about liberated zones, right? Liberated zones, what would be some of the contradictions that would come up with our current contingents, with our current composition of students? And that was very interesting for me to see as well in that moment. But moving on, Trump, comes to power. He vows to deport international students. I'll be honest, from that moment, I felt that my time in the United States was going to be limited, because I thought that, okay, I'm going to be a target now. New York Post was targeting me, Beitar was targeting me, all these right-wing places were targeting me. They couldn't, every so often they were writing about me and putting my name out there, right? And then my legal team said, okay, what could we do to offer myself and others who are similarly situated as well? And I said, you know what? Let's just go for it. I'm going to sue Trump, challenging the constitutionality of the executive orders. The argument we made was the executive orders, A, chill speech, B, deny Americans the ability to hear speech as well. And that was the kind of argument we made. And yeah, I can't lie, I was ready and prepared for a long, drawn out court battle. I was thinking, okay, it's going to go to the first federal district court. Then, we're going to have the Court of Appeals and potentially the Supreme Court. That's what I thought. Boy, was I wrong. Within 2.5 weeks, I had, talks of FBI, DHS. I was told to surrender myself to ICE custody. My visa was revoked. They subpoenaed my emails and my social media. Like, they were gunning hard for me. And after we lost, I guess when we had an unfavorable ruling by the first judge, we then filed another temporary restraining order. And I think at that point, given the lawlessness I had witnessed on the streets and the kind of flagrant disregard for any semblance of rule of law within the United States and the disrespect of the judges, I no longer had confidence that even a favorable ruling would guarantee me or even give me the ability to walk the streets anymore without being kidnapped or abducted. So after 2.5 weeks of being in hiding, I took a very abrupt decision to leave the United States. And those are things. Now, I mean, there's some other things, but I don't want to bore you down with all the details. But I think that's kind of like a quick overview of where things are.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I want to pivot to something a little bit, and we can come back to some other stuff. Maybe come back a little bit more to your personal case. But there's been some commentary in the chat, and even when I put this title up of the thumbnail, people came after me about the idea. I'll bring one of the comments up, and we can kind of address this because it gets into a point that I do want to talk about.
Yeah, please.
Which is that the thumbnail implies that fascism is a liberal phenomenon when it's patently conservative every time. So the first thing I want to say with respect to this is that when I say liberalism in the sense of this thumbnail, I'm not actually referring to anything related to what people think are liberal politics versus what people think are conservative politics. I'm thinking of more along the lines of liberalism as a political philosophy. Um, and so I'll just share my screen quickly just to give a couple of examples of this. I mean, this is Wikipedia, which obviously I'm not suggesting is some sort of great authoritative left-wing, source or anything like that. But this definition that it starts with is essentially what I'm talking about. Liberalism is a political and moral philosophy based on the rights of the individual, liberty and consent of the governed, political equality, the right to private property, that's an important element, and equality before the law. Liberals espouse various often mutually conflicting views depending on their understanding of these principles. That's where you get what people might think of as the debates between so-called liberals and so-called conservatives, depending on their understanding of these principles, but generally support private property, market economies, individual rights, including civil rights and human rights, liberal democracy, secularism, rule of law, economic and political freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion, right? So I wanted to share that just to clarify for folks what I'm talking about as a kind of moral and political philosophy. Now, when I talk about fascism related to this, I'm talking in the vein of things that Ami Cesar has said. I'm talking about the work of somebody like Domenico Lacerdo in Liberalism, A Counter History, and even his book, Stalin, History and Critique of the Black Legend, and other works of his. He gets into this a lot, which is that what we think of as these politically liberal countries, Western European, the United States, that there is always a fascistic component, and it's directed most prominently through imperialism, right? And through colonialism to people that it, you know, somehow creates mechanisms to put these people outside of, they're not citizens, they're not, or if they are, they're sort of second class citizens. It allows for apartheid, it allows for genocide, all of these things are possible and have happened within the history of liberalism. And so I just want to clarify that for folks, because
Yeah.
it's not me saying that I'm not trying to argue, for instance, that somebody who's truly liberal, I don't know what that means to folks, but if they think Bernie Sanders is truly liberal or whatever, that he is more fascistic than Trump. That's not the argument that I'm making. It's that both of them uphold the same kind of system of liberalism, which I believe also includes these same fascistic currents within it. It's just a kind of a debate about how many people are included and excluded within this group of, who has some level of immunity from the fascism, I guess. And I think imperialism and times of anti-imperialist struggle are where we see a lot of the contradictions and the falsehoods or the mythologies of this system. And I think, many people have pointed this out, but God, and you have said it too, in terms of the idea of Palestine or Gaza holding up kind of a mirror to the world. And so if you just want to talk about some of the ways or you're feeling about what has been exposed in terms of, of liberalism and the kind of world liberal order in this time.
Absolutely, and I just want to echo. I agree with everything that you say, and I think that's a very important clarification that you made. Just to add, I mean, I'm in a discipline called Africana, right? Africana in itself was what we call an imminent critique of the entire Western liberal order. And what we're saying by that is that the presence of Black folk and racialized others destabilizes the heart of the liberal order, right? Because you say this is your conceptualizations of the human being, but then you have all these people who you treat like this. How is it that you can have these contradictory approaches to human life? What is it about? And rather than saying that it's a aberration, a feature, or a bug of the liberal order, the argument that the Black radical tradition is making, and Africana studies and so many others, colonized folk are making, these are not bugs, features, or aberrations within the system, but rather this is its most honest face. Right, and the presence of racialized others destabilizes the entire Western liberal order, and we've seen it in Palestine. Is one of the greatest examples. It is the greatest example today, because we've just seen it mask off moment. Right, in times of crisis, it reverts to what we've always known to be the genealogy and foundations of liberalism, which is genocide, extermination, and killing. Right, that is what it is. That's what it's always been. It's an exception, and I really appreciate you bringing Aimé Césaire, because I think Aimé Césaire, in that short book of Discourse on Colonialism, so beautifully lays this out. Right, it's not that the liberal order, it's not that they got upset that they were destroying and genociding and killing and maiming and enslaving racialized minorities. It's when that was turned inwards, the imperial boomerang, that's when it was like, oh, whoa, because fundamentally liberalism is for what? It is for the reproduction and upholding and maintenance and managing of white supremacy on a global scale. That is liberalism. And that's what we mean by that, right? So when we're saying that, oh, Bernie, marginally Bernie might be better on certain things, right? But fundamentally, the system that he could not see beyond. And it's a shame, because we all know now, with Trump and the tariffs, neoliberalism has no answers. It's clear as day. If you think of the work of Giovanni Arrighi, right, he talks about the signal crisis versus terminal crisis, right? And we can talk a bit more about that for my theory buffs as well. But fundamentally, since the 70s and 80s, the US has no more answers, right? Talking about bringing back industry, it's not going to happen. How are you going to train the workers? The USA has no public capital. Only China will provision 20 years infrastructure project, whereas US capitalists will never do that, right? So my point of saying that is, we clearly, the neoliberalism has no more answers. When we're talking about the distinction between those in the squad, or social democrats, etc., is that they will not see beyond the system of liberalism as being the correct moral political philosophy that will bring about whatever their notions of freedom and liberation are. When we know, and I think it's the cliche we say on the left, but I think we're at a time where it really is socialism or barbarism at this point, and we're seeing that. And we're seeing that it's either we're going to be able to transition to a new system that talks about, that upholds ecology, that upholds, we pay attention to climate catastrophe, we pay attention to those in the global south, etc. We pay attention to the war machine and infuse an anti-imperialist internationalist politic, or we're going to descend into barbarism. And I think what Giovanni Arrighi says at the end of Adam Smith in Beijing, it hits prescient and quite scary, in which he says that there is a way in which the US can accept multipolarity. There is a way in which the US can transition to a new way of social relations between us. But it seems like the US would rather burn the whole world to the ground first, as opposed to living with people who don't look like majority people in the US in an equitable manner, in that we distribute resources fairly, etc. So that's what we mean by liberalism. So again, yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And I think, as you're talking about that too, I'm in my mind making connections too to, we've had a couple discussions in the last week about India and Pakistan and Kashmir right now. And it's like wild. Like, I've never seen the level of, like, I thought Zionists were bad, but like you start to put content up that disrupts the dominant view of Hindu nationalism, and suddenly you just get way more people like, just like, you're spreading misinformation, like, just, and it's like, are these bot farms? I don't know. Maybe they're just like real people who are so indoctrinated into these views through their own media ecosystem that it's like, when we think about what Trumpism is or Zionism is, it's just that, like, on steroids with a lot more people, because India has way more population than either of those countries do. But there's a similar kind of ethos, I guess, in some respects, that we could see between these different right-wing nationalisms, and that in this kind of, like, as you said, we're more comfortable like burning it all down, like maybe risking, nuclear annihilation or World War III, than we are in trying to kind of navigate what is a world where, there's a little bit more diffusion, I guess, of sovereignty and polarity,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So what else did I want to say? So let's go back. So let's talk a little bit more about the climate of political repression on college campuses now. Obviously, you were targeted in a lot of ways, and I can't really imagine kind of like what that was like for you on a personal day-to-day, psychological level and all of that. But I'm curious kind of what effects it had on you personally, and if there are ways that you wish people had shown up for you differently, or ways that people showed up for you that were like, really amazing. And I'm thinking about this partly because I think it's important. There's other folks that are obviously scared, they're going through things. I've had people reach out, ask me to like kind of scrub episodes of like their identity and stuff like that, and I'm always happy to do that, for especially for students and people on visas and things like this. But I'm curious for you, like what went well, or what did you wish had gone differently?
I think I'm still, if I'm being honest, as you said, I'm still like kind of reeling and processing. I haven't really sat down and like relaxed and been able to like take it all in. But I think some of the things, again, I had amazing people around me, man. I mean, that's from like practical things, or when I was in hiding, bringing me food, bringing me, ensuring that I'm eating, ensuring that I have finances when I need it, checking up on me constantly when they can, because again, you have to be very careful about using phones at the time. So I would say I had a great support network. I would say for me, it wasn't, I don't think I went without. I also recognize that, I think given the kind of high profile nature of the case, there was a lot of people who wanted to help out and wanted to reach out as well. So I recognize that not everyone will have that support. And I think if I was looking, you asked me looking back, we have these networks, and I think they're developing more and more, but we need to but this is a greater question of we need to build a mass movement of the left, right? That's a greater question of that, because I feel like in these moments like this, we should have been so organized that we could have a response to these things, because we knew the repression was coming. Now, was I taken a bit aback that the universities repressed students to this level? I was. I thought suspensions, banning from campus, but calling the police on their students, arresting faculty, rescinding of degrees, like even I was a bit taken aback. I guess maybe quite naively, or now I'm looking back, right?
I was too. I mean, quite honestly, and obviously we have a vibrant history of campus struggle in this country, in the late 60s, early 70s, like people were literally burning down ROTC, military buildings and stuff like that. So there's plenty of history of it. And and a history obviously in that respect of National Guard being called and even people getting shot, so those things happen. But I would also say that I felt very similarly, particularly that it happened also on Ivy League campuses in that way too, because of the way that the elite in the country also, their kids go to Cornell or to Columbia or to Harvard, right? And do they really want, that climate of repression on the campuses that their children are on? I found that to be kind of fascinating to observe,
No, absolutely, I agree. And I think in the ways in which people showed up, I think I'm never going to be one to tell people what to do in terms of everyone has to make an assessment of what they're willing to kind of put in. But I would say that we are, given that we've protested for so long, tactics wise, and I know there's great campaigns by PYM and other organizations that I'm attached to and I organize with, or I know people who are in those organizations. But I do think that the level of sacrifices that people need to be willing to take, I think we have to up it just a little bit more, because I think, we've seen what we've seen so far. That's why, again, shout out to what Columbia just yesterday, man. Columbia students are back on it. Hundreds of them are out again. Columbia is the cesspit of Zionism right now, the meaning like they are really gunning for people. And they're really repressing people. And Eric Adams and Marco Rubio are tweeting about it. But the fact that these students don't have the fear, this is where I draw my sense of inspiration from. So I want to shout them out as well. But I say, just more of that. I think we need more of that. And I think what has become clear is that this is not going away. The student movement is not dead, right? It's going to continue. It's going to continue. And I feel like what I keep reminding myself is that I believe 100% that Palestine will be free. Like, that's my complete conviction. And because I have that conviction is the reason why I proceed the ways I do, because I think it's only a matter of time. Yes, there's going to be people who are going to take hits for it, but it's only a matter of time until we are, situated and praying and celebrating a free and liberated Palestine and Aqsa. So that's my conviction. So I think that's the kind of my impetus to why I move the way I do. So I think if we continue to have that conviction, which I know so many people do, we have to proceed with that in mind as well. But I would say overall, I don't think I have any critiques like that. I think there's always things tactics, strategies that I might not always agree with. But one thing I've taken a position, this is just my position in general. I don't attack movements that I'm broadly in agreement with in public. I just feel like you're just doing that for social media and for engagement. I don't ever do that. If I have a critique, I will somehow reach out to people. I will, be involved, etc. I'll try and express it in a way that's a revolutionary critique and not a reactionary critique, right? Not because we can disagree on strategy and tactics, but I think people I'm broadly in agreement with, I don't see any utility in just coming and attacking them online. Given that we don't have a strong mass movement as it is, there's no need to fracture more and more, if I'm being honest. And that's just my position. But so I don't have a massive critique. I think people showed out for me in amazing ways, and I want to say massively thank you to every organization, my legal team, etc. But I would say, as a point of knowing what I went through and looking back in the gift of hindsight, and I'm still thinking about it, it's becomes clear that we need a broad base mass movement. And I think that's probably my only thing that I would say about that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate the approach to criticism, and approaching it directly with folks rather than getting into airing different things online. But also, I agree, that we have to figure out, you know, just more ways to build organizations that kind of meet the needs
Yeah,
of, I mean, I think if there's anything that we can say, and it's a thing that has left me in I'd say a state of despair at times, or depression at times, is just like, we didn't have what we needed to be able to meet what we needed to be able to do in this moment.
yeah,
And I don't I don't want to I don't want to express defeatism, because I actually think that, you know, it may not be that long
yeah,
before conditions change.
yeah,
And there's a lot changing. I mean, I think there's some interesting contradictions right now with within the ruling class, and
yeah,
different programs that Trump has, and whether there will be, a ceasefire. Obviously, ceasefire is not not, obviously there's an immediate need to get aid into Gaza, and so that
yeah,
is like a huge thing. But that's obviously not the goal for Palestinians or for the solidarity movement with them.
yeah,
Um, but I do think that also that this moment does speak to organizational needs, and I think that those also can develop quite rapidly you know if the opportunities come
yeah.
forward, and people have to create those opportunities. Um, so let's talk a little bit about your newest project.
Yeah,
So Vox Uma, right? Did I say this right? Pronounce
yeah,
it correctly for me.
yeah. Vox Ummah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So just talk about what this is,
yeah,
and some of the work that you all are doing there, and the politics of it.
yeah. So I would say, yeah, honestly, it was for such a long time. We have this question, how many iterations of the same debate of religion being the opiate of the masses is going to be a recurring theme on social media, right? The famous Marx quote. And for so long, it was interesting to me because we spoke about Malcolm in the beginning, and I've always understood that whilst Marx gives me one of, I think, the best analysis for capitalism and political organizing, the ethical commitments doesn't for me come from my commitment to Marx, but my ethical commitments comes from my faith, right? Because the question can be, okay, now you have this analysis of exploitation. You have a scientific analysis of how exploitation works, how it's reproduced, how capitalism works, etc. If someone was to say to you, but why should I act? I don't really, for me, maybe my lack of reading so far, but you don't really get the ethical commitment from Marx why you should act, right? For me, I get that from my faith. And then I was very much, again, I can quote several Quranic verses that speak about the distribution of wealth and wealth not being hoarded. And I believe in the revolutionary potential of Islam. Not to say that there are, of course, reactionary forms of all faiths, right? But I think in the moment when you found this hashtag called Islamo Curious, it was a time in which people were trying to make sense of this Palestinian resistance movement, who, think about the imagery and the iconography that is invoked, right? Tufan and Aqsa, like at the flood of Aqsa, and Ansarullah speaking about it being a religious duty to stop the genocide. All these things came together, and I wanted to put out there, and those who know me for before I was on my Marxist embrace will know that I was very much involved in the Islamic online sphere. And I had a lot of critique, and I still do have a lot of critique of Muslim scholars, right? I think they are, a lot of the time, there's some people who do great work locally, but I think the ones that are more known are all too often act like influencers. And I don't think they're pushing the discussion in terms of activating that revolutionary potential that I think Islam has. right? Especially we need that in the West today. So I wanted to kind of offer an analysis, or at least put out there in the Islamosphere, that whilst you have all these other people doing various things as it pertains to Islam, there is also a tradition and an analysis that does not see a contradiction between adopting a Marxist third world Marxist anti-imperialist analysis whilst having your ethical and religious commitments to Islam as well. So it can be found on social media, it's on Twitter, it's on various platforms in which you can just go on there and you can get an analysis, right? Because again, the question becomes the Islam of Mohammed bin Salman is very different to the Islam of Malcolm X, right? One is talking about revolutionary potential. One is talking about the kind of upending of society to institute a new and inaugurate a new order, which is based on equity, right, and ridding ourselves of capitalism and taking an anti-imperialist stance. And another is the upholding of, you know, the worship of money and the upholding and just being opportunistic. And we can talk about the legacies and histories of the Gulf monarchies, to which I have no respect for. But long story short, Vox Ummah is a place in which, you know, moving beyond sectarian lines, we are trying to offer an analysis, a place in which people can look at and, you know, sure, I know people don't often read as much, or like don't have the time to read as much, but a short analysis, you can go on there and see, okay, cool, what does a anti-imperialist Muslim have to say about Kashmir? What does an anti-imperialist Muslim have to say about Ansarullah or different resistance factions and groups, right? And yeah, so I think that's kind of where things are. We're very new, we're very excited. If people want to write for us, please DM me, and we can kind of get you on that process as well. But yeah, I think that's about it.
It's awesome. It's much needed. I mean, you know, I think about conversations we've had with Exile, where he's like
Yeah,
implored people to write about these movements in a serious way, you know, and to not just, you know, participate in the demonization and you know, even within academia he's talking about. But I think outlets like this are also a great
yeah.
way for people to do that, to seriously engage with them. Couple things. So I do have some questions in the chat. Um, First of all, shout out to Musa Springer. I know that you've been dealing with your crap from the United States in terms of stealing
One of
your
my favorite
laptop
people
and
in the
everything
world.
else. And yeah, solidarity to Musa, host of the Groundings podcast, another part of the ecosystem that, you know, the media ecosystem that we're a part of. And so would Momodou recommend students get involved in organizing and movement work that extends beyond the transient university space?
Absolutely, and Musa is better than Musa's. Again, Black Alliance for Peace is out there. There's so many organizations. There's December 12th movement. There's so many dope Pan-African organizers, and also beyond that, PYM. But yes, absolutely, I would say join an organization. The university, as Musa so eloquently put, is transient, right? You have 4 years if you're undergrad, PhD 2 to 3 years. You have a summer break. It's you know, I've always said, yes, organize where you are. And I do believe the university is a battleground amongst many, but given the nature of its structure itself does not allow for long-term building of movements in the same way that are connected, unless they're extremely organized to the fact that you have 4th years mentoring, 1st years, etc. It can be done, but again, it's a very difficult, not difficult, but it's a task that has to be extremely intentional. And I think in these places, one of the best things you can do when you're in an Ivy League space is make sure you're connecting to local communities in these places, because whilst when you're away for summer or when you leave, these communities are still going to be around in these places. So absolutely, Musa. And I want to say shout out to Musa, one of my favorite people. Engage with Musa's work as well.
Yes, absolutely. All right, Alex asked this question. Just to clarify, this is not coming from Alex. I know Alex better than this, but is just raising this question. So can you speak to why you would risk it all for the Palestinians who are anti-Black?
I mean, there's so many ways to answer this question. First and foremost, Black Palestinians exist. Secondly, I always find it very fascinating that people who ask this question have never lived in like the Middle East or West Asia or North Africa, where I've lived in Egypt for 7 years. I'm fluent in Arabic. I can talk about how race works in these places. It's not a carbon copy of other geographies as well. And I think, you know, the question becomes, why did so many of the Black radical tradition, Kwame Ture, Sekou Toure, James Baldwin, so many of our revolutionary ancestors sent to Palestine, not as this under this sense of faux liberal attachment and of sympathy, but rather material connection to Palestinian liberation, being intrinsically tied to Black liberation as well. Right. And again, even if you take a selfish position and say, well, they're anti-Black, I always say that to be pro-Black is to be anti-Zionist, because who's training the police officers to kill Black communities? When Israel denied the independence of Algeria, when Israel bombed Tunisia, when Israel supported South African apartheid, there's so many examples where Israel right now, which Cuba is, has a extremely large Black population as well, which is one of the other countries to agree with the blockade against Cuba as well. So my point is that you can take it from an angle of, I believe materially, there's a question of Black liberation is intrinsically, because the technologies that reproduce and prop up Zionism are the same technologies that are then inverted and used against Black organizers and struggles as well. So first question should be, I think you're a human being, and then 18,000 children should cause everyone pause for concern. Secondly, any Pan-Africanist future, any Black liberatory horizon will not be achievable if the impunity of Zionism is allowed to continue. And then thirdly, materially, we find that Zionism is an enemy to Black people.
Absolutely correct. So one thing, as you were saying that, I thought of one of the books behind me is a book about Claude McKay, The Making of a Black Bolshevik, by Winston James. And he has this great section where Claude McKay is in the UK. He's working with, is it Sylvia Pankhurst? I think so. Not that the one of them became a fascist and the other one didn't. I think it's Sylvia. But people ask him why he supports Irish liberation, even though the Irish are so anti-Black, basically. And he's like, I know a lot of Irish people. I kind of, I don't really like a lot of them on a personal level. He's like, I would like to see who they become when they're liberated from British colonialism, and I think that like that's that kind of political orientation, I think, is sometimes something that is lost today, where we get often really focused on kind of individual biases. And I'm not even saying that, I'm not even trying to paint the Palestinians in a specific way around this, but I just think
I was
there's a
going to say,
general
I'm
thing.
so sorry, Jared, yeah, but why is this narrative allowed to run? Where did
Yeah.
we get this narrative Palestinians are anti-Black? Like, I'm so sorry, but where is this coming from? Right?
Well,
Like,
Frank Wilderson, I
I
would
mean,
say.
nonsense Wilderson, because you went to Palestine and then you had some experience. I'm like, I mean, come off it, man. The fact that that's been able to run is like, we have to push back against that. I know we have been, but sometimes I don't know. I because I'm so used to getting that question, I went into that diatribe, but I should have just refused the question, the premise of the question. Where are we getting that Palestinians are anti-Black en masse like that? As if to say it's some structural location of anti-Blackness that exists in Palestine. People are racist in some places and some people are not. But like I've always said this, and I've said this controversially, and I stand 10 toes on this. Even if every single Palestinian was anti-Black, I'll still support the liberation. So let's just let's move on from that.
No, totally. But I think that I guess the reason I brought up the Claude McKay quote, right, is just this idea that like a politics of liberation, it should not be focused on reactionary views that certain members of the population might have, right? Like there's just a fundamental issue with that.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. And I hear Jared Ball on this. I know that he's had Frank Wilderson on. I thought Frank's interview
Yep.
with him was good. I will say that what I my
Okay.
whether people, what I'd say is that is a point where a lot of people find it and take it in a lot of directions that maybe is not Frank's intention or what Frank is trying to specifically talk about. I don't, I have never had a discussion with him
I
about this.
also had Frank on my podcast, so I can also speak to my experience with Frank. And I asked him very explicitly, and he said that I just don't know, and I quote, "I just don't know that a liberated Palestine will be better for Black people in Palestine, for Afro-Palestinians," which I think is nonsense. And I know Professor Jared Ball, someone I obviously respect and honor. And I know you had that conversation with him. So we can talk about that. We don't have to talk about that, but I do know for a fact on my own podcast, he said that I don't know if a liberated Palestine would be better for Black folk, which I fundamentally disagree with.
Right. We'll put a pin in that one. All right. So Musa brought this up too. In 1968, students at Columbia called Kwame Ture and Jamil Al-Amin on campuses to represent the community neighborhoods. Yeah, there's been some great video and stuff like this that has floated around on this recently. The reason I brought it up also is that you talked about this, about Marxism, Leninism, about Islam, about anti-imperialism. Jamil Al-Amin and also many of the Black Liberation Army members, whether Sekou Odinga or Daruba Ben Wahad or others, there's a lot of folks that converted to Islam. Jalil Muntakim also as well, who also was converted partially because he was in prison with Jamil Al-Amin for a brief period of time, and that kind of inspired him on his journey towards Islam.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think that there's a rich tradition there, and I just wanted to uplift that in relation to what the work that you're doing with Vox Ummah, and just
thank you,
as well. All right, let's see. Claudia, so you're right. I think it is probably incorrect. And the fact that I hadn't been around a whole lot of campus organizing to think that, campus presidents calling the police to bust them up is kind of something that, is new. I do feel like we saw a different scale and intensity, but that also probably was because the protests often had a different scale and intensity around Palestine as well. All right. Shout out to Erica Keynes. Don't just join an organization and deeply practice and build discipline. Joining an organization and doing your own thing don't take us any further to being liberated. I appreciate that comment.
Thank you,
as
Erica.
well.
Shout out to Erica as well, I look up to as well.
Yeah. I guess so. I had one other question here, and then I'll see if the chat has any others. But what are your thoughts on why you were targeted? And maybe because obviously you're around a lot of other folks that are doing the same things, that are participating in the same protests, and and so what is your sense of why you specifically were kind of pointed out?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. I'm not entirely 100% sure, but one of the things I think is that, so I was often seen at speaking at rallies, and I think my I'm able to, I would say, push it to the limit without saying that's something that's going to get me I already got in loads of trouble, but I think it could always have been worse, right? So my rhetoric, I think a lot of these times on campus, I was seen as someone that I wouldn't fold on certain things, right? There were certain topics or certain questions of resistance were never a question for me, right? And I've been in intense hostile interviews where they've explicitly asked me to condemn resistance movements, and I haven't condemned, right? And I haven't condemned. And I've consistently, I've stood by my words. I've kind of offered different understandings and different interviews because some of them have been quite hostile. But my point is that I think my rhetoric constantly made me a target, because I think I would not hold back on certain things, right? I'm very explicit on my hatred of Israel. People, especially in a time where campuses are talking about bringing things together. Let's make it about Jewish and Muslims, and let's make it about these kind. I'm like, no. That's not the line we're taking right now in many ways. So I kind of felt that kind of put a target on my back. Just one amongst many things as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Tomorrow I'll be on Saturdays with Renee Johnston and Jared Brawl, and we'll be talking about actually the Harvard reports on. One of them is called the Report on Anti-Semitism and Anti-Israeli Bias, and I thought it's a very interesting. I mean, I don't. No, please, nobody waste your time reading the 400 pages that Renee has me reading for this, but it's fascinating because one of the things that it really locates within the report is how at Harvard, most of what they call most of the Jewish students are either Israeli, or they have Israeli family members, or they've been to Israel. And it's an interesting thing to kind of for the university to name, because they're also, at the same time, then they're talking about whether Jewish students being put through kind of what they would describe as sort of litmus tests or whatever of whether they are Zionist or anti-Zionist, and how this, makes them uncomfortable. And one of the reasons it makes them uncomfortable is because a lot of them are Israeli, or they have family members who are, and so it's just an interesting thing. And I'm sure we'll delve into that more tomorrow. But this idea too of an anti-Israeli bias, being something that, we have to specifically attend to as a separate but equally important conversation to anti-Semitism and kind of what that what that means.
So where chapter 5 of Lana Lentin's new book is a great place for people to kind of read more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in the process of reading that book, and I'm sure we'll have her on soon to talk about it. It's the book you're referencing is called The New Racial Regime, and it works with a lot of Cedric Robinson's work around racial regimes as well, and kind of looks at the current conjuncture. Last thing I had, you mentioned Arrighi a little bit earlier and said you could talk about that a little bit more for the theory buffs. So maybe we close with a little bit of that.
Yeah, I would say definitely. So on my committee is Bikram Gill. He's also on one of my committees. He's someone I consider a mentor to me. I'm indebted to him in many ways in terms of my own intellectual trajectory and shaping and maturity and maturing process as well. And everyone who knows Bikram also knows that he relies on or he uses Arrighi's work and Samir Amin amongst so many others. But I think for me, when I read Arrighi, I think what I find, if I was to pull it in one line, I would say that to be a dialectical materialist is to constantly interrogate the moment in which you're in, and the labels in which we use, right? So when we say things like imperialism, there is obviously, we talk about Lenin's definition of imperialism, but I think what Arrighi does is he historicizes Lenin and says, this is Lenin's understanding of imperialism for that time. What does imperialism look like today? And I think that's for a more modern example, when I'm thinking of China's development, for example, when I'm thinking of more modern formation of how do we understand capital today, for example, does the existence of the capitalist relation overdetermine the system as itself entirely being capitalistic, right? And this is the question we get, is China capitalist? We can start to have these questions, and I find that through Arrighi and Amin, I'm able to kind of tease out and understand this a bit more. And Arrighi really speaks about his understanding of material expansion. He has this thing of okay, capitalism has systemic cycles of accumulation throughout. He has two books, the long 20th century, and it also has Adam Smith in Beijing, who I think, and Geometry of Imperialism, which I think are all amazing books. But I think if you look at his argument, he speaks about capitalism going from what he says a material expansion phase, which is trade, etc., And when it suffers a crisis of profitability, it then switches to financial expansion. This is like speculation, bonds, different loans, different kinds of financial expansions. But it also goes at this time of switching, what he calls this the terminal crisis. You then have a new organizational structure, which becomes the hegemon to better facilitate global accumulation and global capital. That's how I find it really fascinating. I find that to understand China, and also to understand when we're talking about Pan-Africanism today and talking about development, under what conditions are we going to develop countries in the global south, particularly in West Africa? We're talking about technology transfer. We're talking about how do we understand places in which the social relations have been born out of colonialism, and we're trying to break through that in terms of development and reclaim sovereignty. And that's where I find the likes of Origi and Amin really help move my thinking there.
Yeah, right on. We're actually only 5 weeks away from finishing. We've been doing a study group on Samir Amin's Accumulation on a World Scale, which is a mammoth book. And a lot of people told us once we announced that we were doing it that that was not the book that we should read from Amin. But it's been great. I mean, and those of us that have stuck with it, I think, have gotten a lot out of it. And he obviously is also in that time. I mean, that book was written in the late 60s, but in that time period, he's engaging with Origi. He's also engaging with some of the world systems, thinking and so on. Although it's kind of before a lot of that work, but he's a part of that group of folks. And really, really interesting, and particularly that point that you talk about like what are the conditions under which development can occur. He spends a lot of time talking about all of the challenges and the ways that that's hemmed in. And obviously, writing about that question in 68 is different than writing about that question in 2025. But because there are some, with China, with BRICS, so on, like there are some maybe different possibilities now than there were in that era. Although in that era, they also had the Soviet bloc and the non-aligned movement. And so there were also different, there's ways in which the periods are different, of course.
Absolutely.
All right. Let's see, anything else that we got? This is why you were targeted, is because Africans with Palestine are quite dangerous. All right. So I don't know if you have thoughts on this. Somebody else asked this question. What is the role that the state of Israel plays, I guess, in U.S. imperialism's military presence in Eastern Africa from north to south? Any thoughts on this?
No, I'm not like that's not my thing. I have people that I can point out to. I can have a good friend. His name is Ashari ML on social media. I highly recommend people engage with that work. But yeah, I definitely know Israel's definitely involved in what's happening in the Congo as well, through Dan Goethe with his extractive, and as it pertains to the resource extraction as well. But I think my work, particularly more and more, is more detailed in West Africa. I don't want to give an answer which is not fully fleshed out.
Right on. Colin says he posed a question. I'm going to try to find it. Colin, if you can find it, maybe repaste it in the chat because I did not catch it. Apologies. The chat is all over the place. Thanks again, man, for coming in and having this discussion.
Pleasure. Thank you.
While I'm looking for that, is there anything else that you want to shout out, point people towards?
I mean, I'd say the book has come out recently. It's just a collection of the podcasts and a few essays from me. It's called The Malcolm Effect Revisited. It can be found on you can just Google it. People have been engaging with it. I wanted to create a book that's like an absolute introductory guide to certain, I think Pan-Africanism, Islam, Marxism, gender and race. And it's very accessible, and it's very short as well. So people can kind of grab that.
Right on. All right, here's one question that I missed. So, can you speak on the revolutionary faith community and anti-faith hate within the revolutionary community? Can we strengthen interfaith revolutionary dialogue? Can we heal fracturing among distant dissidents? Any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, it's how you, for me, it's how you engage faith, right? I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, faith is always going to be absolutely a revolutionary force, because I think oftentimes it can be reactionary. But what I've seen is that I said, for me, it doesn't seem to be those who attach themselves to a dialectical materialist approach. It confuses me that they just take the category of religion and then just say, okay, they almost ontologize it and say it's always reactionary. I'm like, no, you have to look at materially what is faith doing in these places, right? When you have the Ansar Allah speak about the invocation of faith as it being a religious duty to stand up and stop the genocide, that's something we should think about and take seriously. And I think, I don't know how, maybe the circles that I'm in, so maybe I can have a very skewed understanding, but the circles that I'm in, amongst Pan-Africanists and of people of color, there doesn't seem to be such an antagonistic relationship to faith, which I think is quite telling. I think there is an understanding of those who have, maybe grew up in faith households that have been reactionary, or and again, this is like across the board, right? Perhaps they have a more antagonistic relationship to faith, but my understanding where I am, the embrace of it has been quite positive in my perspective, especially some people, especially the way I try to speak about like merging revolutionary praxis and revolutionary politics to also like Islamic understandings as well. That has been, the reception for me has been quite good. So I can only speak about that. And I think more of that is necessary. And I think this whole thing of, oh, we need to abandon religion wholesale, you're not gonna build any working class movement in the US if you have that approach. If you're serious about building a movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a it's an interesting thing, and I think it's predominantly a Western left
Yeah,
problem in
yeah.
my view. And I think that has to do probably with, secularization and the way that people have kind of been taught to separate politics and faith, and
Mhm.
and then also kind of intellectual arguments around, atheism and so on. And obviously Marx is an influence here. Although,
Yeah,
I always think that quote, there's a lot going on in that quote. I mean, he also says religion is the sigh of the oppressed culture, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. So it's not, to me, even within that quote, that he is like totally taking a complete anti-religious. I mean, he obviously has his critiques of um uh you know ideology and mystical
mhm,
thinking, and wanting to ground things in a materialist critique.
mhm,
But I think that most of, even in instances of communists, countries, or countries that have had Marxist Leninists parties in leadership, that they've mostly had to come to the conclusion, like, we can't stamp this all out, because
yeah,
it's just
yeah,
not, it's not going to work. People won't do for it. And I think, yeah, I mean, anyway, I do think it's an issue, the kind of way that folks on the left get really fixated on that problem. And I think that this point that you raised, if people are serious about building movements,
yeah.
I don't think it's something that we can, um, you know, that we can get too hung up on,
Facts.
despite whatever our own orientation to it might be. Um, Somebody also asked, what do you think of student divestment to starve universities? So I guess this means, and prevent debt slavery. So I guess this means also like students
Yeah, no,
abstaining from attending college and so on. So has that been a tactic that you've seen discussed at all?
I don't. I mean, some people spoke about it. It wasn't like a massively adopted thing when I was on Cornell's campus. Once again, I know people have different levels of precarity, and people are on scholarships and have different people riding on them being at university. So I think it's very. I can't be in a position to say someone that had my education paid for telling people don't go to university, right? But if there was a serious discussion about that, then logistically we can have those discussions and what we think can be achieved. Again, we are 20 months into this. We have to think about all tactics and strategies that can be open, that are available to us. But we have to have serious conversations about these things. But I am not going to be the one. Again, someone messaged me the other day and said, why don't you call for a boycott of all these places? I'm like, well, I know there's been faculty boycotts and academic boycotts of places. If the student movement goes towards that direction, then of course we can have those discussions. But I'm not going to be the one that stands up and says, don't go to university, right? After I've had my education paid for.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I get calls from people. Somebody asked me to call for a national rent strike the other day, and it's an interesting thing that people think. One, I think there's like a misunderstanding that having something like 30,000 Twitter followers
Exactly.
means that like we're going to be able to spark off
Exactly.
a mass action on that kind of scale, when actions like that require a lot of organization, a lot of planning, a lot of structure, but also, as you say, like these are things that need to be debated and developed from within
Yeah,
movements and organizations. Like,
absolutely.
and I would always invite somebody on who was doing serious work around
Yeah,
something like that to talk about it. But me just saying on a live stream or on a tweet that this is what we should do, I think is a misunderstanding of certainly what I see my role as.
facts. Same. Facts.
Right on. All right, man. This has been great. I appreciate
Thank
your
you so
time.
much.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, folks, follow Momodou on social media. I think I have a bunch of the different links, definitely links to your work with Vox Ummah. Check that out. Follow and support your work, as well as with the Malcolm Effect, and stay tuned. So thanks again.
Peace out. Take care.